Edward, who suffers from neurofibromatosis, lives in New York and dreams of becoming an actor. So far, his only role has been a tiny part in an educational video aimed at preventing cruelty and bullying toward people with unique appearances. However, the director criticizes his performance and Edward heads home dejected. On the subway, he watches the people around him fixed on his face. He catches people staring while a passenger starts behaving rudely, harassing others. Just then, another man hands Edward a business card explaining he's looking for individuals with unconventional looks for a film. Soon Edward arrives home and notices a beautiful young woman moving into the apartment next door. When he enters his own apartment, he discovers a leak in the ceiling. Placing a bowl under the dripping water, he begins his household chores. Suddenly there's a knock at the door. Startled, Edward cuts his finger with a knife. At the door is his new neighbor, who sees the blood, quickly fetches a first aid kit to treat his wound. Edward, who feels awkward and only grunts in response to her barrage of questions. As Ingrid looks around, she notices a photograph of a young woman and a little boy. Edward admits it's his mother. Ingrid realizes his disfigurement wasn't congenital. She asks about his profession, but then notices a typewriter and assumes he's a writer. Edward denies this, explaining he found the typewriter on the street. She reveals she's an aspiring playwright, and upon learning Edward as an actor, she suggests they could achieve fame together. Incidentally, she initially came to borrow some laundry detergent. The next day, Edward visits his doctor, who warns him that the tumor growth might soon affect his vision. The doctor offers him the chance to participate in trials for a new experimental drug that could potentially cure his condition. Though the treatment isn't proven, it might transform Edward's life. Returning home, Edward finds his front door freshly painted and deduces that Ingrid was responsible, as the trail of paint leading to her apartment. However, things worsen when the hole in his ceiling has grown larger. Setting a bucket under the leak, Edward takes the typewriter to Ingrid's apartment as a housewarming gift. She thanks him, but her boyfriend arrives, forcing Edward to leave. The next day, Edward auditions for a role by delivering Sio's monologue. Despite pouring his emotions into the performance, the producers remain unimpressed. That evening, Edward shows Ingrid the social ad he was in. The short clip emphasizes that people with unique appearances are a vital part of society and work environments. Ingrid is not particularly impressed, but unexpectedly suggests treating the skin on Edward's nose. However, since no one besides doctors has ever touched his face, Edward feels so uncomfortable. Edward decides to undergo the experimental treatment at the clinic. He lies on a special table while machines skin his face to analyze the tumors. A new drug is then injected under his skin, and to track his progress, a mold of his face is made, and he's given a journal to log any changes in his condition. Noticing his bandaged finger, the doctor redresses the wound. Edward heads home, observing happy couples strolling the streets. Unexpectedly, he spots a new statue of Lincoln and stares at it for a long time. As he walks away, the statue seems to come to life, watching him. That evening, he finds a gift bag outside his door containing laundry, detergent, and candies, along with a note from Ingrid thanking him for his kindness. Edward settles on his couch, opens the candies, but suddenly starts coughing. Removing the wet bandage from his hand, he discovers that his finger has fully healed. Just then, a piece of his ceiling collapses. Later that night, Edward is awakened by loud knocking and shouting from rescuers. They've come to retrieve his neighbor, who has tragically passed away. Edward adopts the deceased man's cat and watches from his window as the young handsome man's body is carried away. The following day, Edward and Ingrid have dinner at a cafe. Ingrid asks him many questions, particularly pleading with him never to talk about harming himself. Suddenly, someone outside taps on the window and waves at Edward, much to Ingrid's surprise. Before parting, she declares that he will star in the plays if she's writing. That night, heavy rain worsens the leak in Edward's ceiling. As he inspects it, a chunk of plaster falls, injuring his face. Wiping the blood, he inadvertently peels off a piece of skin from his forehead. The next morning, the doctor is astonished at Edward's condition, but Edward himself is alarmed. The doctor explains that the healing process involves the shedding of diseased cells and replaced by healthy ones. He gives Edward the mask to monitor the transformation himself. Later, Edward feels unwell but experiences a rare moment of recognition. He stops by a cafe where the bartender greets him warmly and another customer recognizes him. That night, Edward breaks down in tears, but suddenly pulls at his skin, revealing a handsome face underneath. For the first time, he gazes at his reflection, overwhelmed by the transformation, and even learns to whistle, which was previously impossible due to his lip deformity. Soon he goes to a bar where he drinks with strangers, meets a woman, and ends the night in the restroom, marking a new chapter in his life. The next morning, Edward's doctor visits, concerned about his absence from follow-ups. Edward lies, claiming the previous tenant passed away. Adopting a new identity, he introduces himself as Moritz and ushers the doctor out. Unaware to them, Ingrid overhears their conversation. Edward moves into a more luxurious apartment and begins dating various women. Over time, he becomes a wealthy and successful real estate agent, though deep down he remains the same and insecure man. One day he spots Ingrid on the street, and following her he discovers she is directing a play on a small Broadway. Upon entering and hearing a few lines, Edward realizes that the play is based on his life. He accidentally catches the eye of the casting team and gets selected for a role in auditions. But he doesn't impress Ingrid. Determined, he returns wearing his mask. Ingrid is surprised by his new look, but Edward delivers a brilliant performance alongside the actress securing the role. Later he lies to Ingrid, claiming his childhood friend was just like that but he passed away. During his first audition, Ingrid remains indifferent to his advances, and Edward, surveying the theater, feels like just another face in the crowd. Meanwhile, Ingrid is thrilled to have found someone who can bring her vision to life. Later, Ingrid invites Edward to her apartment. He notices his old typewriter and the late neighbor's cat, but says nothing. She offers him a drink and invites him to dance, and they spend the night together. Soon Edward begins rehearsing for the play, and he performs exceptionally, voicing his own thoughts. However, one day a man named Oswald, who also suffers from neurofibromatosis, visits the theater and takes an interest in the production. Oswald is charismatic and finds Edward's performance impressive. That night, Ingrid suddenly asked Edward to put on his mask. When he complies, she bursts into laughter, finding it so terrible. Later, Edward spends an evening in a bar with his real estate colleagues. Unexpectedly, Oswald calls out to Guy, referring to him as a future star and praising his talent, much to the astonishment of the group. Oswald's charm quickly wins over everyone, and he once again praises Guy acting. At the next rehearsal, Edward critiques Ingrid's characterization of the protagonist. They argue as Ingrid relies on experience she doesn't actually possess. Oswald arrives again, swiftly bonding with the cast. Edward grows increasingly irritated by Oswald's sociability. Even Ingrid is drawn to him as they share common interests, including favorite books. Oswald enthusiastically accepts her invitation to stay for the rehearsal. Later, the cast goes out to a bar where Edward silently watches Oswald and Ingrid animatedly discuss her plays. Oswald doubts the plausibility of the protagonist voluntarily ending his life, believing that people like him deeply cherish life. Though Edward laughs along, he grows increasingly bitter inside. Oswald entertains the group with jokes and even learns how to whistle that night. Edward wakes up to find Ingrid rewriting the play. Oswald was right, and her Edward is too bland and gloomy. She's made him a victim, falling into an obvious narrative trap. Edward is outraged when he voiced similar concerns, but she ignores him, so they have a heated argument. At the next rehearsal, Edward loses his temper and his mask keeps slipping off. Frustrated, he storms out in the park and encounters a joyful Oswald, practicing yoga surrounded by beautiful women and admiring the living Lincoln statue. The two head to karaoke, where a charming woman openly flirts with Oswald. When Oswald takes the microphone, he captivates the crowd with his unique voice. Edward watches in disbelief as everyone enjoys Oswald's performance, completely ignoring his appearance. At the next rehearsal, Edward learns that Ingrid has given his role to Oswald because she has fundamentally changed the play concept. She even had to add the role of a handsome man, which Oswald insisted on as he refused to perform without it. Edward is crushed, especially upon discovering how much Ingrid knows about Oswald's personal life. He argues that no one will believe such a transformation by the play's end. Ingrid counters that it doesn't matter, since the heroine sees the protagonist through the eyes of love. Devastated, Edward also faces rejection from Ingrid when he asks to meet that evening. The play premieres and becomes a success, with Oswald receiving rave reviews for his performance. Edward watches Ingrid grow closer to Oswald and sinks further into despair. Oswald gains increasing recognition, even landing glowing press features. One day, Ingrid informs Edward that she must let him go. Edward's mental state deteriorates and starts stalking Oswald and witnesses him with a woman and a child. He confronts Ingrid, accusing Oswald of cheating on her. However, she knows about Oswald's daughter and his excellent relationship with his late wife. She dismisses Edward. Edward overhears that Oswald is moving into his old apartment. In a fit of rage, he smashes the newly repaired ceiling. That night, Edward relives the events of his life. The next morning, he greets prospective buyers in his Edward mask and later goes to the office, scaring his colleagues with erratic behavior, so he is fired. In the evening, he bursts into the theater, causing a chaotic scene by attacking Oswald on stage. During their struggle, part of the set collapses, severely injuring Edward's arms and legs. During his recovery, Edward moves back into his old apartment next to Ingrid, who now lives with Oswald. They are planning a film adaptation of Edward with a renowned director. Edward remains passive, barely reacting to the news. He spends his days watching Oswald live a vibrant life, playing the saxophone and watching movies with Ingrid. Ingrid, now pregnant, radiates happiness, baffling Edward's physiotherapist. When the therapist disdainfully comments on people like Oswald, Edward stabs him, landing himself in prison. Years later, Edward encounters Oswald and Ingrid again. Her play still enjoys success on Broadway, though Oswald is retired. The film adaptation was never made. To Ingrid's relief, the couple is happy and preparing to move to Canada to join an artist community as their children have grown. A waiter approaches to take their order, but Edward struggles to decide. Oswald orders for him and jokes that his old friend hasn't changed a bit.